planning to meet myself. Hi everybody, welcome to my sticky notes. For those of you that don't know, I'm Sam, the experience researcher here at the User Story. And for those of you that don't know as well, Sticky Notes is a fortnightly slot that we have here at the User Story, where one of us just talks about something that we find interesting. So today I'm going to be talking about the practice of research analysis and how it's more of an art in a creative sense than a science. So if you look at Wikipedia for a definition, art is something that involves creative or imaginative talent, expressive of technical proficiency and beauty. So this is how I like to think of analysis. I think it also applies to a lot of the work that we do at User Story and in UX more generally. I think we get bogged down quite a lot in the use of like jargon in scientific language. But if you look at that definition, creative or imaginative talent, expressive of technical proficiency and beauty, I think it aligns quite well. So why am I talking about this today? Well, it's a little bit of a personal indulgence for me, this talk, so forgive me. I'm not a UXer, for those of you that don't know. I've got no real technical background, so I think I approach research and analysis in a little bit of a different way. So I'm a humanities boy through and through, history. From reading horrible histories when I was a kid to my degree to my main interest now, I've got like 300 history books at home and maybe like 2 UX ones, so balance that out. And the one thing that you're always told throughout your history degree, apart from the fact that you won't get a job, is you have highly transferable skills. Now, I thought this was nonsense for quite a while, but I've had quite a few research-based jobs, and it seems to me that if I hadn't have done history, I wouldn't have been able to do them very well. So, where Katie talked a few weeks ago very well about how UX is like conspiracy theories, I'm going to talk today about how UX research is a bit like history. So, what is history? I think a lot of people dislike it at school because it's not taught very well, and probably because of misconceptions as to what it is. So it's just dates and battles and old men with white beards, which is pretty dull and dry, to be fair. But that's not what history is. And like history isn't really the past; it's the study of the past. Essentially, it's a method of inquiry. So it's a collection of stories, really, of like collectives and individuals and how that relates to the society in which they live. It's something that you can use to give meaning to things that have happened. So simply saying, I don't know, 1066 or 1945 isn't history unless you contextualize it. What does it mean? What did it mean to live through that time? What does it mean to us now? And how did it affect how we got where we are? It's also about problem solving. So it's about filling in the gaps of a narrative and putting the case together based on different evidence to understand how something happened and why. But this idea of history is not what it's always been. So the alleged father of modern academic history was a man called Leopold von Ranke, who had a big long white beard. He believed that historians should above else seek to be objective and show things how they really were, which is a noble aim. But if you think about it, it's pretty impossible. How can we possibly know how something really was if it happened 200 years ago? And how can somebody possibly be truly objective? And think about the history that we've lived through. So the Iraq War, financial crisis, and Brexit. Like we each got our own interpretation of that and our own experiences. Who's to say which one was how it really was or which one was truly objective? So what do we do if the original purpose of something seems to be impossible? I'd say we can still do everything. So we can deprioritize the focus on the what and now focus on the why and the how. I think these are infinitely more complicated, but infinitely more interesting as well. It allows us to explore the roles that actual living people played in events rather than just the events themselves. So their behaviors, their prejudices, their attitudes, and how this impacted what was going on around them. And obviously, history can just be interesting too, from my perspective, anyway. Like people have done some crazy stuff over the millennia, so pretending to give birth to dozens of rabbits to get in the paper and earn a few quid, discovering gravity, or divorcing your wife and making a new religion so you can get a younger new wife. So I hope you can begin to see where I'm going this for a bit of analysis from a TUS perspective, but I'll go through some of the key points for history. So it's cemented a little bit more. So the key to any historical analysis is basically interrogating various sources. So that can be whether they're private or public text, pieces of art, music, TV shows, news clips, or architecture. These all have a lot to tell us about the time in which they were created, but only if we acknowledge the context in which they were created. So who was writing that thing, who was saying that thing, what did they believe, what were they trying to achieve by doing that thing, and what else was going on around them when they were doing that thing. So it's only by balancing the content and the context together that we can draw inferences. And this is essentially the basis of history. And an inference is essentially a conclusion reached on the basis of evidence and reasoning by balancing lots of sources together. And this is why history with less sources can be really difficult. So if you've got one medieval monk saying Henry I was a really great guy, like, was he a great guy, or was that monk just looking for an easy life? But on the flip side, if you've got modern history, which has got thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of sources, then you've got social media now, you've got video games, you've got TV and everything. Like, you can't possibly cover everything. So it's about choosing the right balance of sources and making sure that you kind of get a good range. So what does all this have to do with UX? Well, UX research, I think, involves determining your own research methodology. So what kind of sources you're going to have. It also often involves directly interacting with sources created by people. So videos, discovery interviews, moderated testing, even unmoderated testing is from an individual. So you've got to understand the motivation and the drivers behind what they're saying and what they're doing. Like, are they saying that to you because they just want to be nice? Has the boss just shouted at them so they're in a really bad mood? Are they really tired? All this type of thing is to be considered. And we also know in UX that relying on one source or one type of source too heavily can be quite dangerous. So why is this? Well, it's because sources are subjective. So is this a bad thing? Not really. Is it a good thing? Not really. It is what it is. And I would also say that all data is subjective. So we should just accept this rather than trying to pretend something is objective when it isn't. And I think this because anything that deals with people is subjective. So you're looking at emotions, you're looking at behaviors, looking at sentiment, and these aren't rational or quantifiable things. They don't fit into nice patterns, they don't fit into neat theories. I think a good evidence of the dangers of this is if you look at a lot of modern economic theory, which is based on the principle that people are rational and objective actors, which, if you look around you in your day-to-day life, is probably not necessarily the case. So we should acknowledge that our sources are subjective. We should also acknowledge that we ourselves are subjective. So we are doing research in Norwich in 2023, which has its own kind of mental framework and biases, and this should be a lot different to if we were doing research in Norwich even in 2003. The world has changed a great deal. So we at the User Story as well obviously have our own biases. We believe UX to be really important. We have our own mental frameworks and knowledge frameworks that we use and theories that we rely on, but they are just theories most of the time, and this affects our thinking, and we should always acknowledge that. So I think it's important to see analysis as like the product of the analyzer. You can have basic research data, but the analysis is kind of the interpretation of meaning from that. And the analyzer is always an individual, so it has an element of individuality to it. And I think we should embrace this. So inferences, which is that kind of processing of the analysis, comes from one's own knowledge and experience. And if you remove that, you're just left with like the dry, dusty old facts of history, essentially. So if you look at my recent brand validation piece for Wrinkly P, the inferences I made from the sources, which were themselves really subjective because they were interviews and focus groups and that kind of thing, and you can do your best not to ask leading questions, but they are subjective. But my inferences were based on my own interpretation of what somebody said and why they said it. And I did back this up with kind of other sources and built on common themes and all that kind of stuff, but it would have been very different to if somebody else had done the research. But if you strip that back and just presented somebody with kind of the hard data of the focus groups and stuff, I don't think it'd be that useful, and also it would be just as subjective. So this essentially means that the researcher or the historian or whoever it is a gatekeeper, not only of information, but of understanding. So I think you've got a responsibility to make your research engaging, which I try to do, but because if you don't make it engaging, nobody will read it, and then there's absolutely no point in doing it. You've also got a responsibility to make it transparent. So part of doing analysis is essentially taking a side. You're balancing sources to construct an argument and a narrative. And even if you're not being really explicit about it, you are taking a side. So always acknowledge that, and always acknowledge the counterpoints to your argument. So just quick things to finish on in terms of the key things I think I've learned from doing history for conducting analysis is that it's all about stories and relationships. It's a creative and artistic process because it relies on the individuality of the analyzer. And when you're interrogating sources, always look for patterns and commonalities between them and try and relate this to your pre-existing knowledge for extra background. And what I mean by stories and relationships is that look for common threads that flow through all the themes and try and construct a narrative. Stories are really engaging, and constructing your findings as a narrative will draw people in far more than simply relating facts. And I don't mean a narrative in terms of just saying X happened and then Y happened. It's all about developing an argument. I think that's probably the key lesson, is never be afraid to take a side. That is essentially your job. You've got to do it in a responsible and measured manner, but take a side. And probably most importantly, actually, is if new information comes along, be flexible. Don't stick to your guns. Adapt and survive, essentially. But yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. No questions, anyway. Holly?
What exactly is sentiment?
Sentiment? That's a good question, Holly. I suppose it's like the intersection between like attitudes and emotions and stuff like that. But I can get a definition up on Wikipedia if you want.
What soft skills do you think are helping you in your job as a researcher?
I think just the ability to draw in a wide variety of sources and kind of balance them all in your head at the same time, and like just be aware of the different themes that are flying through. I think if that's soft skills, I'm not sure.
When you sort of prioritize and decide between different sources, identifying patterns, you said you need to be flexible to sort of change with the evidence that's presented. Do you think that's more of an intuitive process, or do you have any methods that you employ in order to tell when something may not be the way it seemed at first?
I say it's more intuitive, and you just get an idea of how things are building up. I always like to imagine themes or conclusions. I think I've said this to you before, as like sketches at first. Like they're like in pencil sketches or whatever, they're just kind of outlines. And then as you see more people start to say a similar thing, you add to that and you turn it into a watercolor eventually or whatever. And if you start to sketch something out because you've read 3 or 4 things and then you go down the line and either that doesn't evolve too much, it stays how it is, or if you start to see lots of contradictory evidence, you might just go, well, that's not progressing any further. It's still an interesting point that you could kind of use to counter a more kind of evidence-based theme down the line, but you wouldn't develop any further. Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah. Katie.
So, if your sources are subjective, which I agree with, how do you assess reliability in the outputs of your analysis, or is that just part of accepting inherent subjectivity?
I think you should always accept inherent subjectivity, and I think not accepting it and saying you've done X, Y, Z to make something objective is really dangerous, and that's what the point I was trying to make before. I think dealing with subjectivity is just not relying too much on one source and trying to interrogate the reasons why somebody is doing something or saying something. And just because they might have ulterior motivations doesn't mean you have to disregard it completely. You have just to acknowledge why they are doing something. So like, I don't know, with a politician these days, like you could say, oh, they're going to say the economy's going to grow loads, and like they're a politician, so they're saying that for a specific reason. You can still use that source, but just acknowledge it in context, I think.
Okay, cool.